So welcome everyone to this scenario planning workshop jointly organized by A4S and WBCSD. My name is Elizabeth Toh and I'm Senior Manager Sustainability and Accounting at A4S. It's good to have you with us today. Please try to have your video on where possible and mute for background noise. It will be helpful to also show your name and organization of your screen if possible. Just please note that we'll be recording the first part of this workshop, so the presentation sessions only, and we'll be using it as a learning resource for others. So let me just take you through the objectives and agenda of the workshop. So in this workshop, you will learn about scenario planning, how it helps to assess risk and build resilience for organizations. We will discuss climate scenario analysis, how it supports strategic and operational decision making. And you'll also hear firsthand from companies who are applying scenario planning in practice. And there are two parts to the workshop. So first part, I will be giving a brief introduction to scenario planning before we hear from WBCSD and ERM on the tools and technical know-how of scenario planning, including climate scenario analysis. And you'll also hear from two companies, National Grid and Nestle, on how they apply scenario planning in practice, including a focus on climate scenarios. So part one will be about an hour long, and then we'll take a short break before we move on to part two. So for those of you who wish to participate in an interactive exercise and learn from your peers who are with us today, we'll be exploring together the approaches to disclosing your organization strategic resilience following your internal risk management and scenario analysis exercises. So this could be helpful for responding to the TCFD recommendations. If you've just joined, it would be great if you could be on mute to avoid any background noise. Thank you. So part two of the workshop will also be about an hour long. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have Gordon Darling, Director of the Redefining Value team at WBCSD. We have Laura Langbridge, Strategy Lead, Group Strategy at National Grid. Charles Ellison, Partner of Climate Change Services at ERM. And Alison Buick, Group Head of Risk Management at Nestle. And we also have Lois Guthrie, Director of the Redefining Value team at WBCSD, who will be running the interactive exercise. And you also hear from Helen Slinger, our Executive Director at A4S, and myself throughout the workshop. So before we begin, I would just like to run through some quick ground rules for a productive virtual workshop. So please try to stay as engaged as possible. As mentioned earlier, it'd be really helpful to have your video on so we can see you. There's quite a lot to cover. So in the Q&A sessions and the exercise in the second part, please try to keep your contributions relevant and help us to stay on time. You can post any questions you have in the chat function. We'll be monitoring that throughout. And don't worry if children or pets do wander into the frame. We're all working in similar circumstances at the moment. And I'm sure you're very familiar with Zoom already, but let me just quickly run through the functions that we'll be using today. So as I said, please use the chat box for questions. You should see it in the meeting controls panel, probably at the bottom of your screen. We'll be also using the virtual whiteboard during the exercise. So in the main screen, you can navigate to the options at the top and click the annotate button and select the text to type your comments. We'll also be using polls. So let's try it now. I've got a couple of poll questions for you today. So the first question is really to help us to know a bit more about who's on the call today. So which department are you from? So just to give everyone a moment to fill that in. Okay, so half from finance, but we also have a good mix of sustainability, strategy, and risk management professionals as well. Thank you. And then the second question. So to what extent does your organization apply scenario planning to assess risk and support decision making at the moment? Okay, great. Good to see that many of you are already applying scenario planning. So hopefully you will learn from the experience sharing by the two companies later, and also maybe share your own experience as well in the exercise in part 2. And then just one last question. To what extent are you, or do you expect to be involved in your role with scenario planning or climate scenario analysis in your organization? Okay, great. So some of you are, doing a fair amount or a significant amount only. So we definitely want to hear from you and learn from you as we explore together later on in the workshop. But hope you find the guidance and tools that we'll be introducing to you useful as well. So thank you for taking part in the polls. So what I'll do now is just to spend a few minutes to introduce scenario planning, just to cover the basics and also provide some context before we move on to the more technical content. So what is scenario planning? Scenario planning, also referred to as scenario thinking or scenario analysis, is a strategic planning method that organizations can use to make flexible long-term plans. It is a process for identifying possible future events, so known as scenarios, that might affect your organization, and considering varying courses of action to prepare for them. So examples of business-related scenarios might include changes to the market, supply chain disruption, new product releases from competitors, or environmental and social trends. So what is it used for? Well, it is often used in the strategic planning process of an organization because it allows decision makers to consider a range of potential outcomes and estimated impacts in the future in a systematic way, then devise strategies to respond to these different scenarios or test the resilience of current strategies in an uncertain future. And why is it useful? Well, it's useful because organizations will perceive risks and opportunities more broadly. They will conceptualize different potential scenarios in the future that might challenge their assumptions and also identify sources of risk that may otherwise go undetected. It also helps decision makers to avoid short-termism and also tunnel vision when planning for the future of their business. So for a number of years, both A4S and WBCSD have worked with members of our networks to understand macro sustainability trends and how these trends affect their organization's success in the short, medium, and long term, and how they can respond effectively. So before we hear from the technical experts and the companies with us today, it'll be useful just to look at the changing landscape of sustainability risks. So take the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. So it's in its 15th edition now. So this one, the last one was published in January this year, so before COVID. But let's take a look at what are the top 10 risks over the next 10 years. So across the 5 different risk categories, climate action failure now tops the risk agenda. And for the first time in the survey's 10-year outlook, the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood are all environmental. So they are extreme weather events, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, human-made environmental damage and disasters, major biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, and major natural disasters. And infectious diseases was in top 10 in terms of impact. And every year, the World Economic Forum also conducts an executive opinion survey, asking thousands of the world's business leaders to identify the top risks for doing business in their countries over the next decade. So this year, the survey was conducted between January and July, so right through the outbreak and spread of COVID. And it shows that all 5 environmental risks that I just mentioned rose in the rankings and were among the top 10 rising global concerns for businesses. And unsurprisingly, infectious diseases was the top mover. So you can see on the screen from economic to environmental, climate now tops the risk agenda, while the economic risks have disappeared from the top 5. And you can see also technological risks, so the boxes in purple, have also moved up the list. And there is mounting pressure on companies from investors, regulators, customers, and employees as well to demonstrate their resilience to these risks. So the techniques and practices you hear today will help your organization to do just that. If you are just starting to look at how macro sustainability trends are impacting your organization, you may want to use the maturity map that comes with the A4S Essential Guide to Managing Future Uncertainty, which we are showing on the screen now. So the guide provides an introduction to integrating sustainability risk into business decision-making. You can use the maturity map to assess what you're currently doing and how you can advance to a leading position across the different dimensions of managing future uncertainty. We will post the link to this guide in the chat function now so that you have it. Okay, so that's a quick introduction just to provide a bit of context. I will now hand over to Gordon from WBCSD for a technical guidance session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you're joining us from in the world. I'm Gordon Darling, and I've been leading WBCSD's enterprise risk management activities for 18 months. In today's short session, I'll give a very brief overview of our enterprise risk management focus within the Redefining Value program at WBCSD, touch on some of the risk assessment approaches that we're seeing can inform scenario planning and help companies to build resilience through the scenario assessment process. So at WBCSD, our risk work is focused on considering how enterprise risk management techniques can be extended to drive sustainability business strategies and to help our members build sustainable business models. In the context of scenario planning, we see risk management very much as a process that can help companies assess and navigate the changing risk landscape, understand factors that will affect your business performance, and to consider the impacts of the conduct of your business on the environment and society, and also then influence the delivery of your strategic objectives. In our ERM work, we have extended the COSO ERM framework, and you can see on the left-hand side of this slide the COSO's definition of enterprise risk management, which is a definite focus on the importance of alignment of strategy to performance. And the COSO framework was updated in 2017, where they recast it from a more sort of internal controls and internal context focus to something that was much more aligned to the DNA of a business, to the business model. So focusing on the vision of the strategy, the business objectives, and the implementation and performance of the business. And so you can see that the COSO framework has very much aligned across the 5 pillars that we on the slide here: governance, strategy and objective setting, performance, review, vision, and communication and reporting. So instead, it allows companies to think about the external business context and very much open.
Sorry, Gordon, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay, we can hear you again. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know why I was just muted accidentally, I think there. So if we could move to the next slide, please, recognizing the challenges of addressing ESG related risks, WBCSD and COSO entered into a collaboration in 2016 and launched our award-winning guidance in 2018 for applying enterprise risk management techniques to ESG related risks. The guidance has 5 chapters, which you can see here, and I'm not going to go through that in any detail at all today, but there's the COSO ERM framework, and it considers how ESG related risks can be incorporated in enterprise risk management techniques at each stage of the process. As such, therefore, the guidance is designed to help companies in a number of different ways, but principally it reinforces the between risk management and sustainability, and by providing a common language and framework for you to operate. So as such, it's a particular use to companies as they plan scenarios, providing that framework against which ESG and climate risks can be internally reviewed, and strengths and weaknesses of your operational model can be assessed, and drivers of business delivery and impact can be considered. And you can see some of the considerations around on the right-hand side of this slide around some of the challenges of looking at ESG related risks, such as the short-term, medium-term and long-term horizons, considerations around different assessment criteria, and the need for more sophisticated tools, and particularly also a focus on resilience. And that's one of the key areas where we have really focused in recent times, moving away from thinking of risk in a standalone context, but thinking very much of it as an element of helping companies build resilience and identify vulnerabilities within their firms. So if we could move to the next slide, please. I'm not going to touch on this in too much detail, but the analysis that we've undertaken has identified some of the challenges in applying impact and likelihood, traditional impact and likelihood techniques to ESG related risks, and particularly the complexity and different dynamics of ESG related risks have driven the focus in looking at adaptability and complexity of these risks in more detail, thinking about the speed of their onset, and of organizations' capabilities to respond, vulnerability to these risks, and how persistent these risks might be. These are increasingly important factors for organizations to consider, particularly as you're thinking about your scenario planning and your abilities to respond under stress tests and different forms of sensitivity assessment. So against that background, if we could click on to the next slide, please. I'd like to share with you some of the insights of some work that we've been undertaking. Instead of looking at risks in an impact and likelihood manner, and looking at them as a connected network of risks. And in this instance, we've been collaborating over the past 18 months with KPMG to undertake what is known as dynamic risk assessment. And instead of thinking of these risks individually, we think of them as a collective within a network, and look at the strengths of the connectivity and the flows of impact throughout the network. So therefore starting to think of risks as clusters. So rather than individually, as groups that might manifest together. And thinking of the network in terms of what are the most influencing risks. So what are risks most directly impact others, or what are those that are most influenced where the outcomes, the impacts might be most acutely felt. And this approach allows us to also think about different stress scenarios and consider the velocity and abilities of different mitigants to impact the network and reduce the contagion and increase the mitigating effectiveness. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. to highlight, this is an example of work that we undertook in the food and agriculture sector, and the report up on the right-hand side was launched at Davos this year. But really, in terms of looking at the risks to that sector, I just want to highlight how you can get additional insight. Traditionally, we would think of the risks in this 2D map of impact and likelihood, and on the basis of the assessment that was originally undertaken, you would look at those risks which are uppermost to the right. So regulation being the most severe, and social media being the highest impact. But thinking about this as a network of risk, if we could move to the next slide, please, you start getting a very different picture. And you start seeing about how the different risks start interacting, and we can build connections between these risks. So this graph here shows a sort of high-level representation of the connectivity of all the different risks within this particular network. And the arrows highlight the strengths and direction of the flow of contagion as risks manifest. The other important thing to highlight here is that we can identify which are the most strongly connected risks. Those risks where if one was to manifest, which other risks would be highly likely to be triggered as a consequence. And in this particular example, we can see two overlapping clusters of risks that have been identified as the most strongly connected risks within the network. We click to the next slide, please. The importance of this type of analysis allows you to then think of the aggregated impact of risks. So the connectivity and the aggregated impact, which together in this particular case, you can see the clusters of risk are significantly higher in terms of their impact than you would anticipate from any one particular risk. The timelines, the 30.6 months, also demonstrate or is an indication of how quickly these clusters of risks were expected to manifest themselves. So again, this is really useful information, particularly when you think about some of the speed of onset and velocity considerations, for example, from the recent pandemic. The other critical element of this, of course, is from the pandemic, we've all identified how connected and dependent we are. And this type of approach can really help you drive some insight as you plan your scenarios and plan your connectivity between the overarching scenario and your business impacts, and review that internally. This type of analysis can really support that activity. So if we go to the final slide now, please. Was this the last? Oh, sorry, beg your pardon, that was the final slide. I thought there was one more. The last thing to mention here is the next phase on from this would be to identify, and we can do this through this type of approach, those risks that are the most influential and most influencing. As a consequence, what it allows you to do is to then think about how you prioritize your risk responses more effectively. And in this particular case, for example, the main influencer, so the number one area of focus to mitigate risk across this network, was understanding agricultural practices, which you can see just below the middle line there, the horizontal middle line. Now, that particular risk would not have been identified as high priority or as high priority compared to the others under traditional impact and likelihood approaches. So I'm really using this example to illustrate the value of thinking of connectivity, the importance of thinking of connectivity. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from the other speakers around how maybe considerations such as these are leveraged and applied in their scenario analysis and planning activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon, for introducing that approach to us. And we'll be sharing the resources and links to the report that Gordon just mentioned towards the end of the workshop. So thank you again, Gordon. We'll now move on to the first experience sharing session. And Helen will be having a dialogue with National Grid. Over to you, Helen.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Gordon. So now we're going to hear from Laura Langbridge at National Grid. So many of you might know the organisation, but if you don't, National Grid is an energy company operating in the UK and the US. They own and operate the high voltage electricity transmission network in England and Wales and the high pressure gas transmission network across the UK. In the US, their gas and electricity businesses supply energy directly to customers, and their strategic priorities include enabling the energy transition for everyone, delivering for their customers efficiently, growing their organisational capability and empowering their people for great performance. So welcome, Laura. Great to hear from you today.
Thank you for having me.
So Laura, I understand you're strategy lead of group strategy at National Grid, and you've worked there since 2012 across a number of areas in the organisation, so vast experience, including regulation, business development and strategy. But since last year, you've been working specifically within the internal corporate scenarios project.
That's correct, yeah. So I started working on the corporate scenarios project in early 2019. And we delivered it to the board and the exec in March this year, actually. So the project ran for just over a year in total.
Fantastic. So, I mean, maybe we could start with that little bit of context then. So, telling us a little bit about, what the approach is for National Grid to scenario planning.
Yeah, of course. So I think we typically start with two uncomfortable uncertainties, I guess. So we recognise that the future will look very different to today. Likely very different. So we have to think back to what was happening 30 years ago when the internet was just being born and the impact of greenhouse gas emissions was only really just gaining attention. And then fast forward that, I guess, 30 years to say, okay, what do we think will truly be happening in 2050, which I think very difficult to truly understand. And then secondly, we recognise that most people aren't really good at predicting the long-term future. So having a range of scenarios is important, and this will help us build almost a frame in which we can consider for the future, but then also help us build a most likely reference or base case in which we can position our organisation now, but then also for the future. So we use scenario planning really as a tool to help us prepare for those range of possible futures, to capture new opportunities, but then also to mitigate against new risks that may emerge. And as we highlighted in that last presentation, then risk are constantly evolving. So we need to make sure that we constantly evolve our scenarios as we learn more about the changing external context. Practically, we look at it from a number of lenses, really, from a strategic choices point of view, so considering our portfolio and business unit choices, and then from a risk and resilience point of view in terms of anticipating and proactively addressing those transitional and physical risks which could occur. We typically update our scenarios every 2 to 4 years, I would say, and it can either be an update depending on how much we believe has truly changed, or a complete rewrite. The scenarios we finished this year, 2019, 2020, were a complete refocus based on the fact that so much had changed since we last did them in 2016. Most relevantly, I guess, in the UK and the US, the net zero target that was set by the UK government. With that in mind, the scenarios focused on a 30-year time horizon, so went out to 2050, which was the longest we've ever gone. Previously, our scenarios went out to 2040, which is still difficult, but 2050 adds that extra lens, I guess, but it seems to be comparable with what other people are doing externally, so it felt right. Our focus is mainly on the UK and Northeast regions. As you mentioned, that's where our current footprint is. But we obviously look at it from a global focus, and we see what's happening on global trends and speak to people from across different geographies across the world to make sure that we're not being too narrow in our focus. And then really the scenarios were for internal purposes only. So most people, or some people, might be familiar with National Grid's future energy scenarios, which are external facing scenarios, which are stakeholder ran, industry led scenarios, which are published each year and are run by our electricity system operator business. These were very much for internal strategic and risk management purposes. They won't be published externally. However, versions of them were used for our TCFD publication earlier this year. And then our approach really is, the narrative needs to be obviously challenging, but it needs to be plausible. So they need to be internally consistent. The 4 scenarios we generated this time were quite polarized views. They were very challenging to believe, but we modeled them and they stand up. So supply meets demand, for example, like they have to physically work. We translate them into a quantitative picture, and that's quite a key part of the process. And it's something we're still working on quite a lot to make sure we've got the tools in place to be able to do that, to make sure that people can believe in them, and then ultimately use them in the businesses. And we then ultimately apply to understand what that means for National Grid. So understand the specific implications for each of the business units, and then that enables us to then make appropriate choices or address risks for those businesses.
So how do you actually use those specifically in that long-term decision making, and building it in with the rest of your strategy, risk management, and understanding resilience for the organisation?
So from a strategic planning point of view, they're input into the portfolio strategy at a high level, the business unit strategies, and also we use them as a signpost tracking. So we use them to make portfolio and business unit strategic choices. Ultimately, the scenarios play out a number of different assumptions to understand how those conditions and our choices might change. For example, we use it to stress test our portfolio. So if a business performs moderately to strong in all scenarios, that indicates there's resilience for a variety of futures, which obviously is great. Alternatively, if our business units perform particularly badly in 3 out of 4 scenarios, that enables us to be able to question if actually that's a business that we want to continue to be in the future, and also make appropriate decisions around, if we choose not to, at what point would be the best point to exit that business. They also help us build a reference case. So scenarios are obviously very challenging, but they help us understand what the best view of that future could be for us, and then therefore plan strategically long term, both in the short term, I guess, out to 5 years, but then also 5 years and beyond, to understand what that means. And particularly as we're a regulated business, how we should therefore continue to engage with our regulator, with the government, and ultimately with our customers. So really important. And then from a risk management point of view, it assists us in long-term decision making and allows us to optimize and prepare for the various outcomes. Obviously, risk is inherent in every decision and process that we make, but the scenarios we ultimately look to address the different risks which are raised by each of the scenarios, not only for risk mitigation and management, but also understand what decisions eventually should be made as a result of those. So if the risk is deemed almost too great for the reward or the return, it will impact the decisions that we make in the short term and the long term. And then some of the examples of how we've recently done that. So some of the key things, like market risk, that came out of our recent scenarios were, we knew that the operating environment and the regulatory framework were increasingly going to be aligned with decarbonisation goals. Therefore, we've shifted our focus as an organisation to ensure that, as you read out with our vision and key strategic purposes, enabling the decarbonisation transition is now a central part of our purpose, and guides everything we do. And then in terms of a number of the changing commercial opportunities identified, we responded by shifting part of our strategy to focus on electric vehicles and how we can enable that transition in the UK and the US. We focused on understand what it could take to run low carbon fuels for our network. So for example, hydrogen and RNG rather than gas, recognising that gas isn't a renewable fuel, but it probably will be key to the transition. In the US, we acquired a leading solar and wind developer, where we can have that footprint. In the UK, our license doesn't permit us to own generation, but in the US we can. And then from a security and reliability point of view, one of the key things which I identified was that electricity demand will become increasingly peakier, and it's going to grow substantially as multiple sectors shift to electrify, ultimately to decarbonise. So we then work with our businesses to understand how we anticipate those changes and how we can manage and invest in our networks to make sure they are fit for purpose, not only now, but also for the future, as our customers adapt and evolve. Great.
Makes sense. I love the technical term there. It'll become peakier.
I'm sure the guys in the control room wouldn't like that language, but ultimately that's what it looks like on a chart.
Indeed. So I guess you mentioned some of the difficulties with sort of looking ahead 30 years, and you talked a little bit there about things like, hydrogen coming into play. what are some of the challenges that you come across in applying scenario planning when you're actually doing it in practice, and that looking ahead piece? And how do you sort of overcome those challenges?
I think one of the most difficult challenges we had early on in the process was getting everyone on the same page to understand what scenarios are and are not, and how they can be used. Everyone, it seems like, has a different experience with scenarios, so level setting that is really important, and building that common understanding about how and where we should use scenarios, and ultimately not to forecast for the future. And we probably shouldn't be making substantial investment decisions off the back of them, but they can be guiding those decisions. As a result of that, we recognised that getting people involved from broader sections of the business was really important. So even though it was led by the strategy and market fundamentals team, early engagement internally across the business, especially with the senior leadership team, was really important to just do that level setting. And the second probably is about building the capabilities required to do, in terms of like the blue sky thinking, but then also how you then quantify that to and ultimately enable it to be valuable and be used by the businesses. That takes time. So this time round, we were building off models that were built multiple years ago, in which the whole team had pretty much changed, and that learning hadn't been shared. We're still going through this learning exercise now, and it will be something which we now continue to iterate each time. But in terms of understanding the market, building out value pools and how we think value will shift across the energy value chain, and then linking that to the company's financial models. They're ultimately very difficult to build, especially, and a year sounds like quite a long project, but to touch me, it wasn't long enough to do this in the detail that we really wanted to, especially in the fact that I mentioned we were previously quite reliant on the FES scenarios, and they were used in quite a lot of decision making, but since the electricity system operator was independently separated from grid, we no longer have access to the in detail analysis as part of that, and therefore this was almost stepping up a new team to build that internally again, so that we could start to make sure that that analysis could be there to support the key decisions that need to be made off the back of scenarios. So yeah, I think getting people on the same page and then building the capabilities, which don't happen overnight, is really important.
Fantastic, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions coming through for our audience. The first one is from Tyler. Tyler is at Natura. Tyler is asking, how centralised was this process at National Grid, and were the scenarios run by individual business units?
So it was very centralised. So it was run by the group strategy team across the UK and US, supported by the market fundamentals team, which in our organisational chart sits under the same heading. So it was very much led from the core, but engagement with the business units was an ongoing part of it, on sort of like a monthly basis. We had steering committees which had key leaders from parts of the business in it. We had working groups which had more sort of like working level management that helped inputs into the scenarios. We also had key challenge groups which included internal and external bodies of people. For example, in Anna, the UK head of risk, was sat on that body to make sure that we were constantly being challenged. And then so ultimately it wasn't us then delivering it to the business units and saying, we've come up with these scenarios, now run away with them. They ultimately were a key part in that process, and therefore when it came to finalising them and getting them signed off, they were already using them in their decision making and future planning purposes. So it wasn't really a handoff, but yeah, it was very much led from a centralised point of view.
Great, thank you. And if we can manage it in 2 minutes, we've got time for the last question that's just come through from Anthony. Anthony is at Mondi Group. And Anthony's asking, what tools were used for your scenario analysis at National Grid? So were there any specific tools that you used?
So we were very fortunate that the market fundamentals team do long-term forecasts. Ultimately, they create a base case for us as a business that goes out to 2050. They use a model called Plexus, which models the electricity power market, and they model all of Europe. And then we have a US market fundamentals team that models all of the US. So Plexus was very much the power market model of choice because we had that capability built up, and a vast resource of people to pull on that were experts in that area. So that was our power market tool. We bought in a gas markets tool because currently it's not sort of a tool that we had developed in-house, and that was built for us by Navigant, and that was not an off-the-shelf product. It was built very much dependent on what we wanted. And then we in-house built a value pools model, which ultimately the market, the power market and gas markets tool was very much making sure that the scenarios worked in principle, supply met demand, we understand how much generation needs to be built out, etc. The value pools then took that analysis and said, okay, how much does, as a result of that, how much does generation, what's the value of generation in the future? What do we think future returns would look like versus today? And that started off by very much building a baseline of what we think value looks like today, which obviously is pretty tricky because people don't publish that as sort of easily in their end of year reports and things. So a lot of diving around for information and trying to gather what we could, which is why I mentioned further work is needed and we need to continue to develop those tools. And then once we had a baseline, it was saying, okay, where do we think value will go off the back of that? Will it go up or down? And what's driving that value? And we used some strategic tools like 5 forces analysis to be able to help us guide those decisions. It wasn't all where we could, we quantified it, and where we couldn't, we used strategic tools to help us guide decision making and put some rational sort of barriers around it.
Great. So a few in-house bespoke tools and a bit of Porter's 5 forces thrown in for good measure.
Yeah, I think ideally in the future it would be great if we could have everything in one package. We wasn't as lucky this time, but that's definitely something the market fundamentals team and us, we're working on now to have sort of like a whole systems model. And I think companies externally that do this year on year, like Shell and BP scenarios that publish them for external purposes, very much have those models. So learning off the back of the experts, I think is really important.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for all your time, and you've given us a phenomenal amount of information there in a very short time. So thank you very much indeed.
No problem.
Great, thank you, Helen, and thank you, Laura. That was very insightful, and thank you for the questions from the audience as well. We will now move on to a technical spotlight session on climate scenario analysis. And I'm pleased to introduce Charles Allison, partner of climate change services at ERM, a global sustainability consulting firm. So Charles has more than 20 years of experience as an advisor to multinational businesses, governments, and international organizations on the management of environmental and sustainability issues. So over to you, Charles.
That's terrific. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And I just want to check that firstly that you can all see my slides.
Yes, it's fine. Thank you, Charles.
That's terrific. So what I'm going to talk about today is really just to give a run through, really based on scenario analysis in line with the TCFD recommendations. And I'm really going to draw on the initial TCFD recommendations that were proposed, recommended back in 2017. And then I'll bring those right up to date, but by talking a little bit about the latest guidance document that TCFD has just released in October of this year. So those of you familiar with climate change will be well aware that TCFD released 3 sets of or 3 recommendations documents back in 2017, and one of the documents specifically calls out the use of scenario analysis. It's a technical supplement that really focuses in on how to apply scenarios in assessing and indeed in managing climate-related financial risks and indeed opportunities. Those of you familiar with TCFD will know that it asks organizations to disclose the actual and the potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on their businesses and their strategy and their financial planning, where that is material. And really a focal question of the TCFD is to ask, what is the resilience of your organization's strategy, taking into consideration different climate scenarios, including a 2 degrees centigrade or lower scenario. So very much forward-looking and really recognizing that there are a whole range of plausible futures for how our economy's relationship with the climate might evolve, both low carbon scenarios and potentially higher carbon scenarios. So TCFD recommends a process for using scenario analysis. And you'll see that it sets out firstly the need for governance around the scenario process. Who's going to be involved? How is this going to be integrated into the way your organization carries out enterprise risk management, how it carries out its strategic planning. And I think we just heard from the dialogue with National Grid a little bit about how the scenario process is really integrated into their scenario planning and their strategic management. So that's number one. Clearly, number 6 at the end of the process, we have documentation and disclosure. So TCFD, of course, is a disclosure framework, and as organizations, you will have choices to make around how much of your scenario analysis you ultimately put into the public domain and that you discuss with your key stakeholders. But I'd like to focus in this presentation on the middle band, if you like. So what happens in between number 1 and number 6, and the TCFD technical supplement sets out a process which goes progressively through assessing the materiality of climate-related risks, into then identifying and defining a range of scenarios, both transition and physical scenarios, then on to evaluating the impacts on your business, and identifying what the potential responses might be, either to mitigate the risks or to capture opportunities. So I'd just like to talk through that process in some more detail. So let's break this down into some key steps. We might think of firstly identifying the risks and opportunities for your business. Secondly, we might think of selecting appropriate scenarios and developing those in enough detail, enough granularity, so that you can use them to really test your business prospects going forward. Then we might think about the qualitative assessment of likelihood and impact, really thinking in terms of alignment with your enterprise risk management framework. And then number 4, we might think about how do you build that into a quantitative model that actually helps you to understand what is the impact in dollars and cents of these scenarios. So I'll just talk through each of these one by one. If we think about risk and opportunity identification, those of you who know TCFD will know that it provides a really helpful categorization, listing of the different types of risk and the different types of opportunity that climate change may bring, both in terms of the low carbon transition and in terms of the inevitable physical changes that we're seeing in the climate. So you've already got here, a very helpful typology that you can use, that indeed, all of your peer organizations are increasingly using to make sure that you can think about climate change with the same kind of terminology, if you like. So organizations we find will often use this when identifying and articulating the risks and opportunities that are relevant to them. And I'll just pick in some ways the easy example of carbon pricing. So oftentimes organizations will see that introduction of carbon pricing might lead to increased operating costs for their business, and of course that might mean a loss of profitability. Or indeed on the flip side, if we think about an opportunity, a growing demand for low carbon products might lead to a loss or a gain in market share for the products and services that your organization sells to the market. So we'll typically see organizations taking the time to use this typology of risk and opportunity to frame the risks and opportunities and articulate those risks and opportunities that are relevant to them. So let's then go on to think about scenario selection and development. And we typically see organizations developing scenarios by thinking about the driving forces that are relevant to climate change, and developing scenario narratives around those driving forces, which can be linked in turn to different temperature outcomes. So let's think of a 2x2 framework here, where we have a couple of key driving forces. That could be the extent of a global policy response to climate change. On the right, you might think of a policy response that's coordinated and strong. On the left, you might think of a policy response that's fragmented and weak. And then on the vertical axis, we could think about technology development as a driving force. Is the extent of technology development going to be high, or is it going to be low? And using a framework like this, we can start to think about some scenario narratives. We could look top right and think, okay, a coordinated, strong policy response with lots of technology development. That could be summed up as a global ambition scenario, where major economies are adopting ambitious policies within a deepening Paris Agreement, and that's driving rapid deployment of low CO2 technologies. On the bottom left, we've got the polar opposite of that: climate emergency, fragmented, weak policy, slow deployment of technologies, and that leads us to an overshoot of our emissions limits. And we could start to put some temperature indicators on that. Top right, we're heading towards 1.5 degrees. Bottom left, we're heading towards 3 to 4 degrees. I think what this allows organizations to do is to really start to have a conversation, to build a narrative, and then of course it can be possible to start to quantify different elements of these scenarios. And there are a whole bunch of data sets that you as organizations can use to build that quantification. On the transition side, you've got all the IEA data sets, you've got country specific, you've got sector specific, and indeed you've got technology specific projections, scenarios that you can apply. And then on the physical side, we've got all the IPCC data sets, CMIP5 going into CMIP6, and indeed the country specific information that I know our UK Met Office produces, and many other meteorological offices around the world. So lots of reference points that you can start to use to build out these scenarios. So let us think then about how an organization can start to think about the likelihood and impact of risks. And I know all of you in your organizations will have within your enterprise risk approaches some sort of risk matrix. It'll typically be 5 by 5. I've shown it here 3 by 3 just for sake of simplicity. And I think that what we see as being very helpful as a starting point is for organizations to start to take their articulated risks and indeed the opportunities and start to think about how they are potentially going to play out under different scenarios over not just the short term, but also the medium to longer term. And we recognize that for many organizations, it's difficult to think about the longer term. We know you're all very good about thinking about the next 12, 18, 24, 36 months. You'll all be thinking about your existing business planning cycles, but what about beyond those cycles? And if we were to take any of these risks and opportunities, we could start to plot them now. So where are they now on your risk matrix? Where might they be in 2030? And where might they be in 2050, given some of the scenarios that we're talking about? Of course, 2050 is going to be way beyond most of your business planning horizons. But of course, that's the timeline that we're thinking about in terms of all of our societal climate targets. you know, we see that it's relevant to think about the very long term when we think about climate change. So I think that the benefits of this is that it allows your stakeholders within your business, and we recognize that there will be many different functional and maybe business unit stakeholders that you need to engage with. It can be helpful to have the discussions conceptually to begin with around how these risks might evolve in the medium to longer term. I think this will certainly help at an organization level to start to you know, form views on what are the likely most material risk and opportunity drivers, and which are maybe going to be less material in financial terms. And we see, you know, oftentimes that this can be really helpful in then teeing up what comes next, and what comes next we will typically see as the quantification in the sorts of models that Laura just mentioned in the previous discussion. So let's go on to step 4 then, and think about financial quantification of these risks and opportunities. You know, of course, this involves getting down to the numbers, and we often find it helpful again to think about really framing, you know, articulating the risks quite carefully. So let's think again about a risk which is framed as introduction of carbon pricing leads to increasing operating costs and loss in profitability. How might we model that risk? We might need to think of it in terms of a financial impact equation. You know, we might think of the CO2 price in dollars per ton times the CO2 emissions minus any exemptions that the organization might get through a cap and trade or a tax scheme. And then we've also got to consider how much of the cost can the organization pass through to its customer base. You know, that gives us the residual risk of a CO2 price. And we might want to put that into a simple spreadsheet model. There'll be a whole bunch of parameters that one needs to think of down the left. Those parameters will vary depending on the scenario that one thinks about going forward. You know, are we thinking about a business as usual type scenario? Are we thinking about a 2 degrees centigrade or lower scenario? Those data points will need to come from somewhere, and so that's where an organization can start to dial up all of those reference points that I mentioned before. That there may be individual functions within your business that have ownership, if you like, of tracking and monitoring those data points. And then you can start to think about how they play out over time. How do these data points change over time from 2020 through 2030 to 2040 and beyond? Some of these data points will be external to your business. Others will really be determined by your own decarbonisation strategy. So, you know, what is the profile of your emissions going forward? What are the technologies that you're using for your production or in your supply chain? And what does that mean in terms of residual CO2 emissions? You know, all of that will drive an outcome, and you know, we can think of any manner of dashboards. Here's one where, you know, we can simply plot the cost of CO2 pricing to a business over time under a 2 degrees centigrade scenario or under a business as usual scenario. So we often see how you know, this sort of quantification of scenarios really starts to bring alive the challenge, if you like, and can be used to do the what-if analysis around all of the different decarbonisation options that an organisation may have. So if I could maybe just sum up, I'd say climate-related scenario analysis is increasingly well established. Indeed, since ERM was involved in developing the technical supplement for TCFD back in 2016, we've seen so many organizations start to apply these philosophies and really start to get internal value from them in terms of being better at managing risk, being clearer in how they can capture the long-term opportunities, let alone supporting them to disclose better and have better, richer conversations with their investors. So we can see how this is increasingly well established. There's increasing amount of guidance and reference sources and peer company examples around the key steps that I mentioned. So for risk and opportunity identification, scenario selection, qualitative assessment, and indeed the financial impact modeling. Quite a lot of information now on the TCFD hub and elsewhere. Clearly that there's a need to work cross-function within your organization to apply this successfully. And I think all of these themes are picked up and embellished in quite some detail in the new guidance on scenario analysis for non-financial companies that was released in October by the TCFD. The front cover of that guidance is on the right here. You'll see a web link to it in these slides. So it really picks up the themes from the technical supplement and presents them in quite a lot more detail. So you'll see here a step-by-step process, if you like, for organizations to go through how they would use the scenario analysis process to really think in detail about financial opportunity and risk. So at that, Elizabeth, I'll pause and happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Charles. Thank you for taking us through the TCFD guidance and the steps that we can take to conduct climate scenario analysis. And thank you for sharing your insights as well. We don't have any questions from the audience at the moment, but if you do have some questions, you can post them in the chat function and we might have time to come back to them before the break. But for now, we will move on to the next dialogue session with Nestlé. So over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you, Charles. So yes, we are now going to hear from Alison Buick at Nestlé. So I think Nestlé probably doesn't need much introduction, but Nestlé is obviously the world's largest food and beverage company. They're headquartered in Switzerland. In 2019, they announced a new ambition to achieve zero net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, in line with the UN Climate Pledge. They worked with Lancaster University here in the UK to assess the impact of various climate change scenarios on their business, focusing on 3 of their key commodities: coffee, wheat, and dairy. And they made disclosure on the project in their annual review 2019 as part of their TCFD disclosures. This year, they have continued to engage proactively with stakeholders to tackle climate change. So Alison, we're very pleased to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. And thanks for the opportunity to take part today. Maybe just as a background, I'm head of risk at Nestlé, and we adopted the TCFD framework in 2018. So it's been a sort of 2.5 years now we've been working on it, and I lead it within Nestlé. And maybe just in terms of context, so we are the biggest company in our sector, and clearly we depend on nature for our raw ingredients. We are an agricultural company, so nature and climate is critical for our business model. And for a number of years now, we have identified climate change as a material risk to the sustainability of our business model. And as you said, Helen, we made the pledge on the 1.5 degree UN climate pledge. And then actually just last week, we announced our time-bound plan on our 2025 targets and our 2030 targets. So.
Great, thank you. So I guess you've given us a little bit of context there in terms of the nature of your reliance on nature and some of the commitments that you've made around climate. Linked to that, then, what was the sort of the motivation behind your company using climate-related scenario analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what Laura had said as well, it's really that, you know, climate change is probably unprecedented in terms of the challenge it presents, you know, to the world. I think the scale of it, the complexity of it, and also there's still tremendous uncertainty as well. On the physical aspect, you know, we've got the time horizons are very challenging, you know, and the time horizon that climate operates on are much longer than political cycles, than investment cycles, strategic financial planning cycles in companies. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges is thinking, I've got to think about 2050 and I've got to think to the end of the century. And that's very difficult, you know, for people to think about what would the world look like then. I think the other thing that's quite unique about climate is it's not just transition, as I said, it's this physical risk that we will have to adapt to a warmer planet. So, you know, the scientific consensus is the world's going to be 1.5 degrees warmer by 2050. So we've got physical impacts we will have to adjust to, no matter what we do from a point of view of transitioning to a lower carbon economy. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to how they'll manifest themselves, and particularly the connectivity, you know, that we might end up with systemic risks as well, and not just acute risks. So I think that's one of the challenges. And the second thing is this transition. So how will the world transition? Will it be orderly, collaborative, or will it be disorderly? And what type of mechanisms will be used from a policy point of view? And how will the market react? How will our competitors react? How will our consumers, you know, what type of choices they're going to make in the future? So I think with this level of uncertainty and complexity, what scenario modelling offers you, I think, is this outside-in approach. So before we're diving into what will we do, it's actually have strategic conversations about where we think the world might move to, and think about these plausible outcomes. And I think what's really important is, I think it was Laura that said that as well, is scenario is not a prediction, it's not a forecast. It is a plausible outcome. Because some of the questions I get asked internally was, why are you considering that? It won't happen. Well, okay, maybe it's got a low probability, but there is a possibility it could happen. So I think it really helps to keep our horizons quite broad before we start to dive in about, okay, strategically, what should we do? How do we adapt? What would be our response? And I think that's one of the most valuable things we have sort of found by carrying out scenario analysis, really enhancing that strategic discussion around the external environment. I think the other thing that is sort of very powerful about scenario analysis as well is playing with the time horizons. So one of the things we did is we said, because transition risk is so hard to think about, right, where governments might move, we kept that quite short time horizon to 5 years to say, okay, it's too difficult to know maybe where 2030 looks like. But on physical risk, we extended that out to 2050. So I think as well as it gives you that option to be able to play with different time horizons as well, and try and make those time horizons obviously manageable based on the types of risks you're talking about as well. And that's where, for me, the TCFD framework has been very powerful in helping to sort of attack what is a very complex and technical, I'm not even going to say subject, but just whole topic, into sort of definable buckets: the physical, the acute, and the chronic, and then the transition, the policy, the legal, the technology, the market, and the reputation.
And I think some of the things you were saying there about it being a plausible outcome, remembering it's not a forecast. I think maybe the current circumstances we find ourselves in the pandemic, and like people never really thought that this would happen, but hey, guess what? It did, and it was there in all the risk models that it could happen, and nobody truly believed that it would. Great. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about the process itself, about how you go through that process of constructing the scenarios and performing the scenario analysis itself. What are the kind of the key stages, key considerations, who's involved?
I think to start with, it's really critical to get sponsorship at a senior level. So to get buy-in at that senior level, because what we look to do, or what I wanted to do, was obviously get different types of experiences, functional experience, market and business experience as well. So that's where I think, to have that sort of multifunctional and broad-based team, you need executive buy-in to make sure you've got, their time in terms of resource. So that's the first thing that I did. I think then we took quite a simple approach to start with. So as I said, we've done 2 years worth of scenario modelling, and you mentioned the work we did with the University of Lancaster in 2019. So we kept it quite simple. It was purely qualitative, so it was all around the narrative. And as I said, we had really, really in-depth, valuable qualitative discussions on that. We focused on 3 of our most important commodities, and then that helped us also just to focus on the geographic sourcing of those commodities as well. You know, we operate in a lot of countries, and our supply chain is across the whole world. So what we tried to do was keep it to a very defined scope. And yes, we did work with external collaborators, the University of Lancaster. They helped us answer some of the basic questions like, okay, what climate scenarios should I be considering? What are the type of time horizons I need to start thinking about? That was one of my key questions, not really actually knowing that much. From a finance point of view, you know, when will the physical start to really impact me, say, in terms of the chronic physical? So we took a high level approach, and we had a small cross-functional team within Nestle working on it. So we learned a lot. I think what we probably learned was that we needed to learn more. So in 2020, what we decided to do was move to a quantitative and a qualitative approach. And this year we've worked with the University of Cambridge, who have a specialist department for risk studies. Mm-hmm. And what we decided to do was build both a physical footprint of our business as well as the commercial footprint within the model. Because one of the things that we have in terms of our greenhouse gas footprint is more than 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our supply chain. So it's absolutely critical to have that global overview of where are we sourcing from, both from a physical and a transitional exposure point of view. So I said we built this kind of digital footprint, both from a physical and a commercial point of view. And in terms of building scenarios, we did not want to invent the wheel. There's a lot of publications out there, literature out there around the scenarios. And we used IPCC, a lot of that, as well as the International Energy Agency, as well as specifically for our sector, we've got the Lancet. So the Lancet have done a lot of research and modelling work into, you know, how a healthy planet is going to contribute to a healthy diet and vice versa. So we went a little bit industry specific on that as well, particularly on the market and the reputation risks. So really trying to use what's already out there, so we haven't built something that's bespoke and might not make so much sense when we speak to an investor or other stakeholder. So we used publicly available data where possible. Probably one of the challenges is thinking about what variables am I going to flex within my scenarios. So the physical was relatively easy because there's a lot of scientific consensus around how the world's going to evolve from a physical point of view, depending on the different temperature horizons. But on the transition, there's still a lot of question marks. So we spent a lot of time discussing what would be the relevant variable under technology, under policy. And sometimes it felt like we weren't getting very far, but I think you have to be patient as well in this process, because a lot of it is around the qualitative discussions and sharing perspectives from different geographies, from different functions. And in the end, we kept it quite simple. We flexed 2 variables per transition risk. I think the other big question was deciding the time horizons. As I said before, what is practical when we think about transition risk? So as I said, we stuck with a 5-year time horizon there, but on the physical, we had both 5-year time horizon for physical, but also looking out 20 to 30 years. And I think the other thing I would say is, at least from our perspective, in terms of building competency, both from a climate point of view and climate knowledge, as well as modelling, it has been very beneficial to work with the universities that we've worked with, because they've brought in competencies that we didn't necessarily have in-house. And I think particularly on the climate science, so they've got real substance behind how the climate is going to evolve. And I think also in terms of the modelling work as well, to really have that sort of digital footprint of our business through both of the angles.
So get the buy-in from the top, get the right team internally, get the right team externally, and then you're pointing in the right direction. I think it's interesting what you said as well around, 70% of your emissions are from your supply chain, because I hear that so often. Once actually companies do that analysis and get a real sense of where their impact is, that is no way uncommon.
And actually, I should say, I liked Gordon's chart before when he was showing, maybe by chance, the agricultural sector. So one of the key levers to help to reduce our carbon footprint is around moving to more regenerative agricultural practices, which was identified as one of the key risks in the dynamic risk assessment framework that he was showing. So yes, and I think that's the other thing about why scenario analysis to me is very useful is, you know, we've got to look across our whole value chain. So I think it helps you to consider, right, where am I getting these ingredients from? How do I source them? How practical is that going to be with a warmer planet, for example? And then how do I get my product to my consumer? So that's where my customer comes in. And I think we need, and I think it's the same with most companies, we need both our suppliers and our customers to work with us together on this journey. You know, so it has to be collaborative. We have to have the commitment. And I think discussing these sort of possible future worlds, I think it helps to get everyone on the same page as well. And that's not forgetting the investors who clearly, you know, the whole drive is with TCFD is to help drive capital allocations to lower carbon, you know, business models, products and services. Well, I think it really helped. Sorry. No,
I was going to say, let's talk about those investors then as a final question. We don't have any from the audience, so I'll take the chair's privilege of asking the final question. You know, how is this, all the scenario analysis that you're developing and the information that you're putting out there in the public domain, you know, how is that being used to engage with your investors, I guess, but also with your wider stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I think what TCFD has definitely done, given it's so heavily supported by the financial community, is really driven up the importance and the awareness of using scenario modelling to tackle this sort of unique challenge. So it's a topic that comes up regularly in many of our investor engagements, as you would expect, given sort of the materiality of the risk, particularly for the agricultural sector. And I think what it helps to do is to facilitate that conversation around, okay, this is where we think it's going to play out. These are our key exposures. Okay, so this is what we've thought about. And I think it's it's a two-way conversation. They're trying to do the same thing across many different sectors. And I think what it does is it helps to set the context in terms of, okay, so this is our strategic pathway to try and manage this. Okay, so we have to adapt in certain cases, particularly on the physical, but then also we can mitigate and also exploit opportunities. And I think that's one of the great things with TCFD. It's not all downside, and Charles was showing that there's this opportunity as well. There's this tremendous opportunity when it comes to innovation and technology. And so I think, you know, our roadmap, as I said, is all built around regenerative agriculture. And so what scenario analysis I think helps to do is to put that in context, because we're trying to manage this over here and this here. And I think the other thing that has been very useful is around trying to connect different risks. And to me, that's one of the biggest challenges of the planetary challenges, is that they're all linked. So we haven't spoken about biodiversity, but clearly biodiversity is very dependent on stable climate as well, or pollution. And I think we need to build on this still. We need to mature in our scenario modelling, but starting to connect the different exposures. But also the great thing is that we see that many of our responses can also help to contribute positively to different planetary risks as well. Mm-hmm. But I think going forwards, that's one of the things we want to do. We want to connect more of the planetary risks. And maybe just one thing I would say, I know there's a lot of people joining from Europe. I do think the EU sustainable taxonomy is very useful in its very holistic approach that it's taken to trying to obviously encourage more transparency around disclosures when it comes to contributing to, you know, a healthier, cleaner planet. And it doesn't just focus on climate, but it talks about biodiversity, it talks about water, circular economy. Yeah. So I think as well as that framework is interesting as well to consider, you know, going forwards, that we capture the full scope of the planetary challenges that we're facing, and they're all interconnected.
Thank you very much, Alison. Again, a fantastic amount of valuable information in a very short space of time. So thank you very much indeed.